Okay, so let's just look at a couple of extra problems with Canada as a legal entity. One thing that probably eludes most of the people in Canada is the fact that their constitutional structure is this thing called the British North America Act. Now, we could go back into the history of that, but rather let's just look at the act itself. It was written under the guidance of Lord Thring in the Imperial House of Lords. It wasn't something that was put together by the colonists themselves in 1867. It was put together because independence was flat out denied. It was put together because after the disastrous loss of the 13 New England colonies, the Empire got rid of the Lords of Trade and Plantation that had been given the permission to run those colonies by the Crown and Chancery, which managed the sovereignty claims of the English people plus the monarch in all lands where they claimed it. And they created a colonial secretary and made that colonial secretary a member of the imperial cabinet. And the Crown and Chancery was the vehicle that the colonial secretary was in charge of. And it was the colonial secretary's job and nobody else's job to appoint the governor general, which would run the colony, whichever colony we were talking about. So nobody in the cabinet was going to tell the colonial secretary, appoint this person or appoint that person, because if another colony were lost, the colonial secretary would lose his head. So the whole structure of the British North America Act is to have the colonial secretary appoint a governor general, which would run the colony for the benefit of the empire. And the governor general was the empire's government, which means that the central legislature in Ottawa remained the central legislature simply because they put it there when they created the Upper Lower Canada colony. And as they started expanding the colony of Canada to include the West, the provinces are just administrative jurisdictions with legislatures, but they're not parliaments. They can be overridden at any time. They could think about laws, they could debate what they might or might not do. They could even go ahead and write up a bill. But unless the Governor General said, okay, it wasn't okay. And even still, the central legislature or the provincial legislatures could be overridden by the Imperial Parliament because Canada was a colony. Right? The first Canada that the British created was the Upper Lower Canada colony. The second was this Canada that included the Acadian colonies against the will of the colonists, and then they started adding more provinces. So this huge Canada grew to be the Acadian colonies all the way out to Vancouver Island and all the way up to Baffin Island. Provinces had no authority, none whatsoever. So how did it work? Well, basically, the lieutenant governor of any province was there to aid and advise the governor general. Okay, so let's just look at that in real time. You've got farmers, grain farmers out in Manitoba. They're feeding information to their representatives that don't really represent them, but they're there to suck up the information like a sponge and feed that to their governor, their lieutenant governor, who then puts it up to the governor general. Right? Everything was designed to aid and advise the governor general. So this was kind of like a benevolent dictatorship, basically. When it was running well, and they had the impetus to not lose a colony and not have uprisings, then they would respond and they would say, yes, okay, the farmers are talking with them, well, then we'll consider that and then we'll do something and we'll take some action. And so you had some kind of an impetus to respond to things that were developing, things that the people in the colony of Canada wanted. But after the Westminster Statute was passed in December 11, 1931, the Crown and Chancery passed the sovereignty to the people of Canada. They didn't pass it to the people in the offices in the central legislature, because that was just a central legislature. theoretically it was of more importance than the provincial legislatures, but all those legislatures could be overruled. The central legislature was kind of the center of this collection process that went up to the Governor General, who decided yes or no, because the Governor General was the government. But after the Westminster Statute, okay, the sovereignty wasn't passed to those people in the central legislature. It wasn't passed to the people in the provincial legislatures. It was passed to the people, the colonists themselves, in their provinces, making each province a sovereign state. All right? So there's no longer a Governor General being sent. So the whole structure doesn't really make any sense anymore, because by removing the Governor General, the British Empire removed the government. There wasn't any government. There was just this structure sitting there. So the people in Ottawa basically committed a kind of political coup. And they said, well, we'll just put in our own Governor General with a commission signed by R.B. Bennett. And they just put that Governor General in there. So now they had their own government in the form of this new Governor General. And Canada starts to go down this path that it's still stuck in today, which is you have this illegitimate entity in Ottawa trying to hang on to power, whereas that whole structure was put in place by the Empire because they didn't want to lose a colony. So under that impetus and that design, well, they could run the colony quite well and quite efficiently, and they could listen to people, and they could put this in or modify that, or they could do something to keep the colonists relatively happy and not lose a colony. But once the Governor General was removed, well, that was no longer the modus operandi. The modus operandi became a bunch of jackals in Ottawa hanging on to power and not being pushed out of their offices. Because, why? Because the Westminster Statute transferred the sovereignty to the people in all their colonies. Nova Scotia becomes a state. New Brunswick becomes a state. Quebec becomes a sovereign state. Ontario, a sovereign state. Try and run that one by the people in Ontario today that are still dead loyal to the Empire. You actually made a sovereign state by the British Empire, by the Westminster Statute. That made you equivalent to what the 13 colonies achieved for themselves in blood in the Revolutionary War. Now, from that point forward, those 13 New England states, which used to be colonies, okay, they went on to send delegates from each state to determine articles of confederation and a rhyme or reason for coming together in some kind of union. That's never happened in Canada. So you have this group of people in Ottawa that have decided to stay in their offices, put in their own Governor General, run a political constitutional coup, and seize power. Because if the people in those provinces realize that they're sovereign states, they might say, well, wait a minute, we need to forget the British North America Act and send our own delegates to decide a rhyme or reason for us to be together as a federal union or a confederacy or a whatever structure it's going to be. And once you get that sorted out with your Articles of Confederation, which is what they did in the 1780s, after the success of the Revolutionary War, well, then you have your delegates going to constitutional conferences where each sovereign state says, okay, well, we've got a rough draft now of the sovereign powers we will cede from Ontario and Quebec and Alberta and Nova Scotia to a central federal executive. And those will be debated. Yes, no, we're going to keep those. We don't want to send those. In the United States, the original vision, of course, was a very limited set of powers would be given to the central authority to achieve military union, attack on one is attack on all, political diplomatic union with international states, and some vehicle to resolve interstate disputes. There's really the rhyme or reason to what they did to put together their constitution. But that's never happened in Canada. This is why we see an entity in Ottawa today that does things like what Pierre Trudeau did, right? What Justin Trudeau did. You know, this is their game. They're trying to hang on to power, and they're doing it by, frankly, illegitimate constitutional means. I would call what they're doing as de facto. And as a de facto, it continues to run in the long tradition of the de facto doctrine of England. It's more legitimate than jungle law, but the de jure actually has to do something, and that means from the people of the land themselves. So you cannot do anything in Alberta or Saskatchewan or Manitoba with your politicians because they're all sworn to serve the de facto. So it has to be led by the people. But that right, that sovereignty was granted in the Westminster Statute. But this is why you see people in Ottawa doing what they're doing, which is destroying Alberta. Can you imagine if the British Empire were still running Canada as a colony? Do you think that they would have destroyed so much of the prosperity and the money from Alberta alone with the oil? I mean, trillions of dollars. That's incredible wealth to come into your coffers and to keep the colony running happily. I can't see it really happening. But with Ottawa trying to stay in power and limit this and control that and make wheeling and dealing around the world with big other powers about how things are going to go, and believe me, and you probably know this, and that's what net zero is. Net zero is this very elite game up top for the control of energy and materials around the world. That's really what it is. It's a big window dressing to just say who's going to control this stuff. So now you have to ask, well, who's really running Canada then? These global oligarchs are running Canada through this corrupt entity called Ottawa that's hanging on to power and smacking people all over the place instead of listening to them. Because that rhyme or reason was lost when the British pulled the Governor General away, and these frauds in Ottawa under R.B. Bennett started the tradition of putting their own Governor General in there. So I think we'll leave that there today, and we'll get on to some more stuff in due course.